Thank you for having me back, John Michael. It's good to be here.
My audience really considers it, I hate to use the word a treat, but a blessing, a treat. Oh, wow, you've got SG to weigh in. And so, taking advantage of this opportunity to serve them best, I'd like to cover a variety of topics. Obviously, we can't spend too much time on any one subject because there's probably half a dozen more things I'd love for you to weigh in on. So let's begin with the biggest elephant in the room from my perspective, and also with the objective. I always have the objective of trying to make sense of the madness or clarify and dismantle the deceptions that people within our movement are getting tangled up in, because we got to keep this together, especially at this critical phase as we're sprinting towards a finish line on many aspects of this war. So having laid that groundwork, SG, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba. We'll just cap that off there because we could prolifically discuss other countries in the like Korea and certainly China, which I do want to touch on. But Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. Let's begin with, from your perspective, albeit maybe from a 40,000 foot view, what is the common denominator of these moves? Because seemingly, to the average Joe, out of nowhere, Trump's gone after Venezuela, gone after Iran, gone after Cuba. What is really happening here? What is a common thread behind these moves? And then get as granular as you choose. And please do discuss the implications of the Straits of Hormuz.
Well, it's fascinating that you should frame the first question that way because when we talk about this irregular war that's happening in the world and we can see it playing out, some of it's kinetic and visible and publicly obvious, other parts not so much. But if we go and examine what's happening and what we see actually occurring on the ground in various areas, it becomes very, very transparent that what's going on is a massive realignment. And I would even characterize it as a multi-angular or multi-frontal assault on the old power structures, the old world complexes that have run the entire planet's finances, geopolitics, and markets, military, civilian, political, all of those sorts of things. But Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba is an interesting way to phrase it. And you could even include North Korea in that group. And when we talk about what they have in common, it's a number of different things, but the easiest, most baseline summation for it is that they all served as either direct nexuses or forward operating bases for significant amounts of what we would call the worldwide Kabbalist criminal syndicate to operate beyond the jurisdiction, beyond the reach of certain components of the Western world law, including the U.S. military for a long time, and continue to hold the world hostage, be that through the mismanagement of currency and the manipulation of markets by flooding markets with undervalued resources, or in some cases overvalued resources that are actually worthless. Another component of that is election fraud. Venezuela is a country that we know was involved in the theft of dozens and dozens of nations, separate nations, and their elections through the coordination of their software that was tested and trial run there called Smartmatic, which we know from Venezuelan whistleblowers was exported for use around the rest of the world, was utilized by intelligence communities all the way from Langley over to Beijing. We know that Cuba has not only played host for a long time to components of the Russian mafia, the Russian mob, if you will, and various technological components that they got through contract with the Russian military and the Russian intelligence services. But in recent decades, they've done the same thing with the Chinese. And we know that some of the Chinese accesses, if you will, intrusions into the U.S. cyber landscape on election night in 2020 were coordinated from IP addresses that were found to have been in the Western Hemisphere, some of them coming right out of Havana. When we look at Iran, for example, and North Korea and sort of that axis over there in the Eurasian and East Asian sphere, you've got a lot of the same similar activities, coordination of fraud that's being exported from these groups. The Iranian government itself has for a long time had one of the most reputable and vicious hacking groups, and actually they're a very capable cyber warfare angle that has come out of Tehran for a long time. We know that the IRGC was utilizing those capabilities in 2020 to attack the election infrastructure. Then the Treasury sanctioned them under EO 13848 as a result of that. We know that the same community coming out of Tehran acting underneath of the purview of the IRGC, was just recently caught in the last 6 to 8 months here in the United States as having accessed and infiltrated the entirety of the Federal Reserve banking system with a dormant malware called R-clone. That's the letter R and the word clone, CLONE. So North Korea, same type of thing: exportation of dark money assets, exportation of intelligence malfeasance, protectionism jurisdictionally from recourse and recompense from that, with Beijing being basically on the same side as that broader community because of the CCP's iron grip on the actual movements forward and progression of events inside of China, and especially on the behavior of the government. They really weren't in a position, and haven't been for a long time, to provide any sort of ballast against that. So what we've got between Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, and you could even include Ukraine in that. You could include a couple of the sub-Saharan African nations, including Sudan in that. What you've got going on are these frontal areas, these frontal assault bases, if you will, that the broader black market and worldwide intelligentsia syndicate, and I characterize those as roughly the same synonymously, but having different parallel purposes for their existence. These are the areas where they have been really setting up shop and aggregating their resources, their manpower, their focused abilities and capabilities, and then orienting them against the rest of the world. The Cuban mafia has been in control of Cuba since the late 60s, early 1970s. They were very cozy with the Russian mobsters, who were very cozy, and many of them were direct extensions of the Russian secret intelligence community and the secret police. We know that the CIA has been heavily involved in South America from their own declassified archives going back as early as 1955, when they were conducting operations inside of Paraguay, inside of Uruguay, inside of Ecuador, without notifying these governments at all, even of their presence there. These were dark ops, these were black site ops that were happening. So a lot of this ties back to what have they established in these various areas of the world. What have they been doing in Tehran since 1979? What have they been doing in North Korea since the late 1950s, early 1960s? What have they been doing in Ukraine since absolutely at least the 1990s, but I would submit to you as early as the 70s with the former Soviet Union and some of their intelligentsia activities that were going on there. And we are now seeing a rebalancing of those scales. And this is the part that I think a lot of patriots out there are getting themselves sort of amuck with, if you will, or they're running afoul of the center line here, because the point is not that there is a conflict or there's not a conflict. The point is that there has always been a conflict. And now you are seeing patriotic forces in the form of the U.S. military and in some coalition segments, including, believe it or not, Tel Aviv, and I think patriots that you have inside of the Israeli Defense Force, just as you have patriots in most of the developed world nations here that are partaking in this broader effort. You're seeing that begin to be fought back, if you will. The war is no longer just one-sided, with the lambasting happening against we the people of the world. And in so doing, we have to have these what I would characterize as eruptive events, or perhaps dramatic events. Some of it is pure theater, but some of it is very real, it's very kinetic, and it's serving to rebalance and reshape this construct that has been created around the world with various junction points across several different continents, and that process is not always clean.
So well said. And, it's easy for folks on the surface to say, well, President Trump said he was going to end wars, and now he's dropping bombs all over the place. But the truth of the matter is, that construct of these nations that you've touched on, through election theft, through cyber interference, through state sponsors of terror, through dark ops, as you've outlined, it's all of those things collectively that keep us in war. And so by dismantling these in the fashion that's being done kind of differently in each country, as we see happening with Cuba today, leads to ultimately ending endless wars, in my opinion, among many other things, like stopping the killing of a lot of people of fentanyl, freeing the women of burqas over there in Iran, and so forth and so on. I do want, if you would, comment on on Israel from one perspective. We've covered that quite a bit on my network with other panels. But while Venezuela, Iran, Cuba are being exposed through this operation right now, so is Israel. Do you have any comments about the exposure of Israel, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, where people state, I don't mind saying this, I've been, I've been in and around this subject matter of everything we deal with in the podcast world for 3 decades. And, you know, I don't mind going out on a limb saying something I believe to be true, but Benjamin Netanyahu is not a war hero; he's a war criminal, and Donald Trump isn't being maneuvered and used by Benjamin Netanyahu. Quite frankly, from my perspective, it's the complete opposite. Do you have any comments, whether they differ from mine or not, matter or not? Do you have any comments about the exposure of Netanyahu and Israel as a reason? Because Israel is not, it's not the Israel of the Bible. It's not the Judeans of the Bible. This is a formed state by the corrupt CIA, Mossad, and Rothschild banking, and all roads lead to London here. I think there's a great exposure taking place with Israel. I think in part this is what Hugh meant by stating something to the effect of save Israel for last. Please weigh in on that subject, if you will.
Well, I'd be happy to. And I think as we begin to see the progression of events as they flesh themselves out in real time and the activities coming from various governments in the Gulf region, to include Tel Aviv, to include Riyadh, and even some of the rhetoric now coming out from Ankara just in the last few days, I think what you're going to see with all of them, and of course Israel will be included in that, is a duality beginning to emerge. The duality meaning the actual controllers of the geopolitics, of the geomilitary situation, and the financial situation as well, of control of the resources, exportation of the resources, importation of, in some cases, of the resources, and then the other side of that duality being who the people actually want and what the people actually want. When we look at Tel Aviv, and I would agree spot on with your commentary about, President Trump is not being led, but he is rather, in some ways, acting almost like the Judas goat, if you will, for the Likud government in Tel Aviv right now. A lot of people look at that and they cross-reference what we're speaking about right now with these, public affirmations coming from President Trump in support of Israel, in support of Netanyahu. But you have to keep in mind, sometimes the very best way to destroy a bully is to drag them out in front of the entirety of the playground and get as many eyes upon them as they can and allow them to destroy themselves through their own rhetoric, through their own behavior, through their own inclination or propensity to misbehave. And that's exactly what we have going on at a geopolitical level. A great example of this is the Truth Social post that President Trump put out just a couple of days ago, where he stated that if Iran didn't open the Strait of Hormuz, the United States military would begin targeting power plants in the country, starting with the largest one first. Well, everybody lost their mind about, oh my goodness, President Trump is now, he's targeting civilian infrastructure. This is war criminal activity. He's obviously bought and paid for by Tel Aviv. Right. But nobody stopped to actually examine what the teeth of that commentary, what the teeth of that post actually mean and what it actually accomplishes and does. Less than 3% of the entirety of the energetic landscape, the energy grid inside Tehran, relies on their constellation of power plants. The power plants, the largest power plant and the second one behind that, comprise, I think, a total of 5% of the energy generation. The grid is very decentralized, and they have a lot of substations throughout the entirety of the country. Those substations are connected to dozens and dozens of power plants all across the Persian Desert, from the metro areas in the north to the mountains in the southwest. And so by President Trump saying we're going to attack your largest power plant first, what he's actually saying is we're going to take about 2.5% to 3% of your energy offline. Iran responded, of course, in kind within just a matter of hours to the president's threat, and stated that if that happened, they would begin targeting the critical energy infrastructure inside of Israel, inside of various Gulf member states that were hosting the U.S. coalition. Well, I can tell you, John Michael, that the largest power plant in Israel supplies 24% of the country's entirety of power. So when you look at what's happening here, President Trump is setting the landscape for Israel to have some pretty serious problems as a result of what the U.S. military may choose to do. Another example of how this is playing out in the favor of we the people, and sort of showcasing how President Trump is approaching these things with a very unconventional mindset, what I would characterize as a game theory mindset, is the nuclear site at Dimona. And we've seen a lot of exchanges happening between Israel, between Tehran. We know that the Israeli Air Force has claimed that they have now bombed over 7,000 targets inside of Iran. We know that Iran has a stockpile of missiles that they've been building quite literally for 40 years. They've been updating them as much as they can over the last 25 years or so. And we're seeing that stockpile, depleted on the other side of that. But one of the things that has occurred is that stockpile has been used to target Israel's nuclear site at Dimona. Dimona is the largest nuclear research station that Israel has. It's for what we know, it's basically the center point. It's the headquarters, the HQ, if you will, of their illegal nuclear arms research program and development situation that they have, which we know they funded through U.S. aid that's been coming into Israel for a number of decades. We know that they also amped up their research by literally stealing U.S. military secrets. And I would tell your audience to go research something called the Pollard Affair if they want to know how that happened and what actually transpired there. In 1962 and 63, President Kennedy, and it's very clear through the declassified CIA archives that President Kennedy was attempting to diplomatically pressure Israel to denuclearize itself, to disarm its weapons program, and to come in alignment with quote unquote true Western values. And this was what President Kennedy was attempting to do. And President Kennedy was attempting to do it as peaceably as he could. But it becomes clear from the archives that he was not backing down. He was going to pressure the government in Tel Aviv to denuclearize because he knew that this was going to cause an endless consternation in the Arab world, Middle East. He knew that it was ultimately going to result in some sort of a false flag war that would drag the U.S. into a hot shooting war with the Soviet Union. So President Kennedy knew that this was not something in the best interest for the region. It was not something in the best interest for the United States or Russia at the time. He was attempting to have conversations with the Russian premier about these types of situations and find some sort of peaceability about the arms race that was underway. And in response to that, and for a number of other reasons as well, including executive orders about money and finance, President Kennedy was murdered on live television. Now you have the situation in the Middle East, which of course has grown in magnitudes since that time. But President Trump did not go in and ask Israel to denuclearize. President Trump has gone in praising Bibi Netanyahu as a war hero, literally inflating the egos, ingratiating himself to the point of almost absurd theatrics. There was a post put out on Truth Social sometime last year where it was so over-aggrandized that you could tell President Trump was actually insulting Netanyahu by being way over the top with his complimentary rhetoric. And at the same time, you now have the Israeli nuclear site at Dimona being targeted by Persian missiles. So this was a situation, in my opinion, John Michael, where you have the U.S. president who requires an aim, an objective that has to be met, a condition that has to be satisfied in order for world peace to actually be a possibility. And this is someone who knows the last time that a U.S. president attempted to settle this matter peacefully, he had his head blown off. So instead, we're going to arrange the geopolitical conditions both regionally and internationally to force the permanent destruction of these programs, because we know that they're not going to go softly into that good night, if you will, if we ask them nicely. So that's one of a number of examples I think that's going on. I think the Strait of Hormuz is exactly the same tactic, except this time oriented primarily at the central banking cabal inside of the NATO European countries, which is now starved for energy, will soon be starved for agriculture and fertilizer. We know that they have been starving themselves economically with a tremendous amount of inflation and debt leverage over and above what those countries are able to field with their actual GDP, their actual manufacturing prowess. The refugee crises going on all across Europe adds pressure to that keg. Now we have the Strait of Hormuz shutting off literally some of their lifeblood in a fashion that is going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for them to try and recover from. And President Trump takes to Truth Social and says, please go and protect the Strait of Hormuz. If you use it, the United States doesn't. I'm paraphrasing this, obviously, but people can go look it up. The United States doesn't use it. It shouldn't be too hard. That's absolutely what I would characterize as a troll-style rhetoric, essentially pointing out that we have done for you and done for you and done for you. Mm-hmm. And what we have been and what we've gotten in return is a lot of backstabbing. And so now, because of what the intelligentsia communities inside of those nations has done, because of what the military industrial warlord complex inside of NATO has done, they're going to pay the price at the pump. They're going to pay the price at the market. They're going to pay the price inside of the GDP capabilities of the countries. And that's going to force populism back to the fore and really overcome what I think is a multi-generational, at this point, a multi-generational trend towards socialism that has never been, has never been in the service of the European people since the close of World War One.
Wow. A couple of things come to mind. There's popular memes that are out there. I'm sure you've seen them, with a picture of JFK, the president, of course, as the starter, and adjacent to the photograph of President Trump as the finisher. And I think that meme says a lot to what you just commented on in terms of Kennedy's approach to the situation in Israel and so forth. The other thing I wanted to mention, the Straits of Hormuz. A lot of folks in the beginning said, "Oh, didn't Trump think this through? Now he's got a problem at the Straits and he's begging for help." I don't think begging for help is the proper narrative. I think exposing those that we thought were our friends was a more accurate statement. And so I'm curious, with the problem that strait is causing this world right now. A lot of pain. I'm here in Thailand, as most folks know, and they can't get diesel, and the farmers can't run their equipment. And it's not an ultra established country like America. They need these farmers. Just gasoline and stuff for the cars. Prices are up, lines are huge, and pumps are empty. And we've got similar stories in varying degrees in America and all over the world, with the oil moving up and down and all this. How do you see it playing out? It's got to have some serious positive redirection, because it's all about energy, oil, and then the money going to London, and then China. You've got China. Where are they going to get their oil now? Comment a little bit about that, and in your crystal ball, how do you see this issue of the Straits settling down?
Well, I'll be honest, with it being so early in the process right now, I would be surprised if we see the Strait of Hormuz issue settle down anytime in the very near future. I would think of this as at least a weeks long situation, perhaps a few months to get things sort of rebalanced and reoriented. And what it's causing is exactly what you just described: extreme difficulties in nations that have been dependent on the old world construct for a long time. Some of those nations dependent on purpose, some of them dependent without choice because they were made that way by a more powerful intelligentsia controlled nation state elsewhere in the world. The United States, under Kabbalist control for the last half of the 20th century, really did a number on some of those second and third world developing nations. But what this is forcing, the Strait of Hormuz in particular, is it's forcing a complete realignment in how nations depend on one another and who they're willing to talk to. I've heard it said before that one of the best ways to know how willing someone is to engage or not engage with another person is when they're starving. And so when you look at the situation that's happening now in the world, not to be over dramatic about it here, but I think if we're not careful, we will see some areas, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, potentially in components of Southeast Asia, depending on the monsoon seasons and how those fall and the waterfall that comes with that. We could see some concern about food insecurity. The fuel issue is one that's hitting almost immediately, and it's really hitting Asia, the entire Eurasian steppe and shelf, China, Mongolia, Japan, all of Southeast Asia. It's hitting them really hard. But it's also causing what I think is a fantastic opportunity, depending on how these nations, if they're willing to play their cards in a certain capacity, for realignment in a rapid fashion. Russia is a net exporter now of natural gas, for example, natural gas and energy needs. China and Russia have a very close relationship, and China is sort of hampering down on their own supply because they don't have a great deal of oil and crude and things like that are underneath their own lands. And so they've been ironing out, arrangements with Russia for a long time. Now those arrangements are a little bit more urgent. The same is true of the Koreas. The same is true of Thailand, to a lesser degree, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, because those nations have a little bit of those deposits that they can rely on. They're not enormous, but they are there. But that gives them the opportunity also to do a little bit of trade and make a little bit of money. India is now also looking for, cheap oil. One of the main beneficiaries from the cheap oil reserves and oil derivatives coming out of the Gulf states has always been India for a long time. Proximity, more than anything else, really helps that along. But what we've got now is a reorientation. So, as I understand it, there's an Indian delegation that's supposed to be meeting with the U.S. in coming days to talk about potentially getting oil from the U.S. We know that the U.S. Now has an unusual and very friendly relationship with the state of Venezuela, which has some of the largest oil deposits known on planet Earth.
Mhm.
So, this is an opportunity for the old system to give way to a new way of doing things, but it does have to be done under the auspices of some urgency, right? We can see that happening now. We've already seen, as you pointed out, the price spikes all over the planet, especially in Asia. They're hitting the West really hard, especially in Europe. They're hitting the U.S. as well, but not nearly as hard as they're hitting in Europe and other areas. And you may very well see Europe decide, we really are tired of always calling Russia the bad guy. Russia has a lot of what we need. And to this point, over the last several years, even with NATO ground forces embedding themselves flaglessly on the ground inside of Ukraine and fighting the Russians literally hand to hand and bullet for bullet, you have not seen Moscow begin attacking European countries, because Moscow has maintained the point that this is not about a war between nation states. This is a war against satanic cultism. And they're very pronounced about that. They're not afraid to say that whatsoever. And so you may have some ability, especially with a populist government in any one of the major European powers, such as France or Germany or the UK. You may see that situation begin to cool down tremendously and even warm up to some friendly hospitality. Maybe some trade begins to come back in. We know that Russia has been loath to fully restrict their exports to Europe, not just because it makes them a lot of money, but because they're not interested in an unstable crisis scenario on their own continent as well, while they're engaged in this war in Eastern Europe, a war that I don't believe is going to end anytime soon. Despite some very optimistic prognosticators out there, I just think that Russia is going to continue the conflict until Kiev itself is back underneath the Russian flag, and it may even expand to the Baltic states. But regardless, all of this, I think, pales in comparison when you look at the continental needs of an entire culture. You're talking about the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Spaniards, the Britons out of the UK, all of the Norse peoples and their cultures, and they all rely heavily on the cheap manufactured goods that come out of Beijing, and the cheap oil and various resources, including fertilizer, helium, urea, etc., that come out of the Gulf states. So this is an opportunity, I think, that's being created almost single-handedly by what's going on inside the Strait of Hormuz and with the Arabian Gulf there, that is going to propel nations to either take steps to redetermine how they do things, and in other words, to rebalance trade more fairly worldwide, probably more regionally localized, probably with less geographical distance to travel between the transaction of certain goods, especially critical necessity goods. Or if they don't do that, I think you're going to see some pretty significant chaos situations emerge in various nations, and it could be even in nations as large as China, where the populist component begins to rise up out of that, because that's the only way that the culture survives.
Wow, simple words like this come to my mind as you described that very well. And that is no pain, no gain. That's what's happening. And as the geopolitical deck of cards are being shuffled on one of the most important issues, that being energy, the availability and cost thereof. And so people need to, well, pray, plan, and prepare and buckle down depending on where you are during this transition. I want to jump into another subject and have you comment briefly on this. There are we're talking about the financial world. We're talking about some folks, whether they're economists or analysts or, people in the financial world, or just, there's in the political world, in the podcaster world, there's a category of individuals that say, The stock market, speaking of markets, I'm speaking broadly, stock, bond, and real estate. Those are your main markets, right? So there's a lot of respectable people cut from different parts of the cloth that are in the camp that we are absolutely going to have a bloodbath in those markets. And some will even say it's imploding upon itself, and some are saying it's being done by design to flush out the system and bring in a new quantum financial system, a new currency, and so forth. There is another side of also fairly respectable people in different circles that say we're not going to have any serious correction outside of the bond market. I think everyone agrees on that. It's already happening, but this is an important subject, obviously. I think I know where we're heading down the line, and I think it's a wonderful thing. But to get there, again, no pain, no gain. What are you hearing? What's your opinion and analysis of the fact? I mean, the Dow's dropped 5,000 points in the last, what, couple of months. Where do you stand on this? If you had to put yourself on one side or the other, where would you be? Are we going to have a severe correction across the boards, or are we not?
Well, that might be, and pardon the pun, but that might be the billion-dollar question. And with respect to the market behavior worldwide, I guess I would approach it in a couple of different fashions. We know with the overall objective here, which is the death of the Federal Reserve System, and we were told that very plainly by the faceless, nameless entity online called Q, that gold in particular, along with a new system, which is explained in several other posts, but from the post I'm referencing now, gold in particular would be the avenue to destroy the Federal Reserve System's grip on humanity's monetary control. And when we say monetary control, that's a little bit separate from fiscal control. I'm not a financial advisor, but I know that the monetary component is the more important of the two. So when you look at the behavior of the worldwide banking system, which underpins a lot of those markets that you're talking about, it's taking an absolute beating off of what's happening right now in the world. And I don't think that that's much likely. I don't think that's likely to get a whole lot better as we go forward in the immediate weeks and maybe a few months. You know, as we look towards the 250th birthday of America, I think that we could be ratcheting that up quite a bit. Now, the question, the essence is, are we going to see a crash or are we not going to see a crash? Truthfully, that's probably above my pay grade and I don't know. But what we are absolutely going to see, what I'm not in doubt of whatsoever, is corrective actions inside the markets that expose fakeness, that expose fiat weakness that is not actually there. And one of the things that you're seeing right now with the oil industry in particular and all of the oil stocks and crude futures and everything that ties back to that, including mining, drilling, you know, all of the betting that goes on with those areas, you're seeing the inflationary pressures that are not real actually being brought into the forefront, right? We've seen a meteoric rise in the price that certain oil is fetching, but we know that that's not sustainable. That is a bubble inside the market that we have. We know that the markets worldwide, specifically with the oil construct, the oil industry and apparatus in particular, have all been way over centralized and way overly extended for a very long period of time. And the only reason it's maintained that status quo, the only two reasons it's maintained that status quo since the close of the Second World War, are the U.S. military and the ability of the petrodollar, the Bretton Woods Act, which I believe was 46 or 47, that came out and established how oil worldwide would be traded and how it would be cashed in and cashed out of various regional exchanges. And so when those two aspects are removed, when the enforcement mechanism is removed and then the administrative capture mechanism is removed, honesty has to return to the fore. And the first thing that's going to happen is a pretty significant bubble that's going to form, and that bubble will eventually have to pop. President Trump is aware of that, I believe, because it was just a couple of days before the Iran conflict began. As a matter of fact, it might have been just the day before, where he announced that America was opening its first new oil refinery in 50 some odd years. I think it was 50 or 51 years that we were opening the refinery. We know that the drill baby drill component has been going on since early 2025. We know that some of the earliest guidance issued by the administration and some of its EPA-related agencies was about permitting for things like energy development, things like coal. getting coal back online to generate electricity. Coal can do a lot of the same things that oil can. Not all of it, of course. Oil has a very important place, but coal is a wonderful ballast to help keep some prices down, especially in a landscape that's growing away from petrol fueled machinery and more towards electrically powered machinery, right? So when you look at what's happening inside of that particular market, I would characterize that as a cross section for what is likely to come. Corrections inside of the markets, small enough to not collapse the market, but large enough to get people's attention. And one of the things that happens with each one of them is that the underlying weakness, the underlying weakest link in the chain, is brought out to the forefront and then dealt with. And that has to occur as we go forward in this broader awakening journey before we can have any discussion whatsoever about revaluing our transactional systems worldwide. If we're going to talk about reliquidating the U.S. dollar with a fixed weight of gold and silver, for example, or some sort of fixed weight of tangible commodities, we can't reliquidate anything until we take the thumb off the scale with respect to where that dollar is involved in bond markets, in trading markets, in commerce and real estate markets, certainly in the worldwide energy markets. And every single one of those markets also has to be decentralized to the greatest extent possible. Nations have to be given control over their resources again, but in a responsible manner that does not relinquish that control to some sort of black market syndicate who's waiting in the wings, ready to pounce at the earliest opportunity. That's one of the reasons I think we've taken the approach we have with Venezuela. Venezuela is in a very delicate and fragile situation right now, and the U.S. military and President Trump are aware of that. It's one of the reasons after we defanged the Cartel de los Soles and their control on the ground of the resources and assets in the country, we did not immediately begin turning over, our pressure, if you will. We didn't begin easing the pressure on the new interim government. We began actually increasing some of that pressure, but also going back to the table in a productive dialogue style fashion to ensure that control stays where control needs to stay during this period of instability, which has not been resolved yet in that country, but is likely to be resolved in the coming months. I think the same will be true whenever Tehran winds down. But Tehran is an animal that's about 10x the magnitude of the situation we've been dealing with in Caracas, and that's going to take a lot more care. It's going to take a lot more of some strong-handedness, if you will, to be sure that we don't lose control of that wheel. And as we watch the world begin to rebalance itself, and these markets have these hiccup corrections here or this hiccup correction there, we may see a turn down that we would characterize as dramatic. But I think the entire point is to keep those turn downs wherever they have to come as recoverable as they possibly can be, because the goal is not to desecrate the world's economy. The goal is to reform the world's economy. And the only way to do that is to take the fiat nature, the weakness, if you will, the phoniness is a better way to explain it, out of those economic systems and markets so that they can reflect true value and true transactional behavior between nation states all of the way down to between people themselves, P2P.
Great analysis. You're raising the point of exposing the fraud in the fiat system and alluding to the Q boards, the goal to bring down or expose the Fed. It certainly is doing that. Again, a lot of analysts, and actually, I see very few with any credibility that let me rephrase that. People with, from my perspective, not much credibility that say gold and silver are not going through the roof. I think they're wrong. A lot of folks, including Juan O'Savin, who's not a financial expert but knows a thing or two about currencies, and many people, I can cite the names, but the bottom line, I'm curious what your view is. Are you still in the camp? We had a big pullback the last couple of days in all markets, but including a significant drop in silver and a significant drop in gold. But most analysts have gold and silver, in spite of this recent little blip, is what I'd call it, have gold and silver going through the roof for transformational systems fundamentals. What's your take on gold and silver? Are you in the camp that has silver, say, at 200 or 300 and gold at 6,000, 7,000? Because that seems to be a consensus.
Well, I am in the camp that would state that gold and silver, along with most of your other industrial application metals or any major metal market that's utilized in broad processes, like electrical, for example, copper, palladium,
Mhm.
um, platinum, even, and other markets as well. I am in the camp that all of those are going to have to go up because every single one of them has been affected in a negative fashion, in a downward turning fashion by the fiat discussion that we were just having. And it really does boil down to the fiat versus the real, right? When we look
Yes.
at what's happening inside the pullback with silver and gold, for example, in recent days, and we saw a pullback that happened on the 30th of January as well, which was just absolutely enormous. But when we look at that and we see what's happening with those pullbacks is large, major transnational financial institutions have been forced to demanipulate the very system that they themselves began to manipulate as early as the 1930s and 1940s. And they're having to scramble in sort of a mad dash form to get out from underneath the anvil that they've hung over top of their own heads. And so when you look at institutions like Bank of America, estimating that silver could be anywhere from 175 all of the way up to $300 per ounce by the end of the year. What they're telling you is after we offload all of our derivative shorts against silver, we have no idea where it's going to be, but it's going to be much higher than it is now because we are one of the foundational pillars that has ensured that market cannot reflect a true value. The same is true of JP Morgan Chase. The same is true of the Bank of the City of London. The same is true of HSBC and several other large institutions that operate in a transnational format. And so the pullbacks are temporary hiccups, again, temporary short term events that affect the retail investor only insofar as the retail investor is willing to not be forward thinking and looking at a distance into the future, because it is entirely illogical to believe that that a metal like silver or a metal like gold or a metal like copper or platinum or brass or cobalt, these other major industrial use metals would have values that are so microscopic relative to their actual usage worldwide. Silver tends to be my go-to example
Yes.
because silver is very relatable for people. They understand what silver is. But silver is in every single electronic device on planet Earth. It is the most electrically conductive metal. You cannot get an MRI or a CAT scan without silver. You cannot have a watch that runs on any type of smart technology without silver. Forget smartphones, forget computers and laptops. None of that happens without silver. And so for us to think that silver, for as broadly as it is used, as broadly as it is consumed, and the fact that it enjoys a dual placeholder status as both an industrial application but a baluster of currency as well, it is, again, completely illogical to think that a current valuation, which I think is in the $70 to $85 range per ounce, that's an actual reflection of the metal itself. And so when you look at these large financial institutions and these large market forces that are getting themselves out from underneath, again, the anvil that they hung over their own head, it's going to force the anvil closer and closer and closer to the floor. And I think the mad dash between those institutions is going to be who can get out from underneath the anvil first,
Mhm.
because not everyone is going to get away clean. And as that time comes, I think you're going to see an escalating skyrocketing in the value of several of those metals, to include silver and gold and others, because the forces that have been suppressing them simply cannot compensate for the cork floating effect that is now happening as both the major institutional space and the retail investor space begin to pay attention and hold these commodities rather than selling them back for pennies on the dollar.
Yeah, great analysis and sweeping change to be noted there. And I love, I love the content that you just provided about how the banks and other elements of the system, what they created and profited for decades off of our backs, is now forcing them. Like you said, the guillotine's going to come right down on their own heads and having to make changes. One of those changes are Goldman Sachs, I think, Merrill Lynch, Chase, Bank of America. These folks have all indicated in their investment portfolio models, they're recommending now 30% in precious metals, whereas historically in the Wall Street and banker world, they've poo-pooed it 5 to 10%. That's about it. Now they're at 30%, and that's quite frankly shy. But it's a great big change taking place, and the Q boards was spot on. No surprise for me there. I'd like to jump into a different subject. Again, to our audience, I've got three or four more other topics. I have SG, since we've got some of his time today, to touch on these issues. So I'm going to move us along into this. Russiagate, okay? Brennan and Clapper and the Klan. Mueller dies. Black Swan event? I don't know. Curious to what you're saying. At the same time, Russiagate is gaining momentum. We know all the files the DNI has released. We know President Donald Trump, through Truth Social, has commented on it, saying, arrest Obama now. Treason. All roads lead to Obama. There are reports that Obama is lawyering up. And for those that think he's already been done away with, perhaps, if so, we'll be shown that. But at the end of the day, I'm going to stay on this line of questioning. Do you think the Obama issue, of course, it all ties into the election theft and the election interference, and all of these things are high treason. But there's a lot of chatter, not in unimportant circles. We're talking about the DNI. We're talking about the President of the United States making public statements and really and saying we've got all these records now. What do you know about Obama lawyering up, and what's your view on this becoming a little more center stage now? What are your thoughts on that? Is this a before July issue or an after July issue?
You know, it's funny that you asked that question, because as we watch the progression of events concerning Russiagate, you know, all roads lead back to Obama. We've seen that statement a number of times from President Trump. But what did Obama do? Obama set up the years-long treasonous coup against the government of the United States that the U.S. military allowed to happen on purpose in November of 2020. And the reason they did that was because they knew at that point in time, the United States was not yet capable of absorbing the full truth of the multi-force attack that had come against their country from a number of actors, both foreign and domestic, both nation state and individual. And the media apparatus in the country still had enough of a sway that we could have ended up with a second U.S. Civil War. So that entire process was allowed to occur. We saw a continuity of government period emerge after that, where President Trump was insulated as a candidate, maintained certain access to very high-level military command, but at the same time, we saw the installation of what I believe to be a militarily controlled puppet in the background, who went on to act as the deep state's new sort of, you know, head at the table, if you will, and did a lot of damage on his own to the very construct that we would want to see damaged. The draining of NATO's reserves, for example, the overstretching of the U.S. dollar in the form of treasury bonds worldwide, the dramatic amount of inflation here in the United States, which slowed manufacturing to a crawl, further defanging NATO and preventing them from being able to really resist what the Russians began in 2022, which really was only a continuation of what NATO had started all the way back in 2014. So I'm all over the board answering this question, because this question is at the nexus of a lot of these events. The events in Ukraine 2014 to 2020, the events in the Trump administration all through the first Trump administration, the events of 2015, 2016, the $1.7 billion cash flown out of the country and delivered to Tehran so that it could disappear off the map, the destruction of a secret Iranian nuclear satellite facility that existed in the northeastern Syrian desert during the first Trump administration. As a matter of fact, I think that strike was ordered almost immediately after Trump was in office. 67 Tomahawks, if I'm not mistaken, struck that facility, but we were told that it was a strike against the chemical warfare agents of Bashar al-Assad, and that is simply just not true. So looking at what we have with respect to Russiagate, and we have DNI Gabbard saying a couple of times now, you know, we have it all. We have a massive core evidence component of treasonous conspiracy information. We have several grand juries that are running parallel to all of these events, who have made indictments, who have issued warrants and approved of warrants to be executed by the FBI in multiple election jurisdictions. Over 20,000 files just recently seized by the FBI out of Maricopa County, Arizona. Maricopa County is an enormous county population-wise. This is not a small seizure that occurred down there. early last year, this was a more quiet one that came out. It wasn't widely reported, not widely discussed either, but early last year, the Office of the DNI, through the FBI and the U.S. Marshal Service, actually seized Dominion election machines out of Puerto Rico that tied back to the 2020 election as well. So looking at all of this Russiagate situation, when we talk about Russiagate in 2020, we're actually talking about two sides of the same cylinder. One side at the beginning of the cylinder that kicked things off, the other side that closed the cylinder and in effect closed the trap against them, because we had all of the evidence we needed to show what had occurred and how the longitudinal progression of events led to that, how the mainstream media assisted in preparing the country for 3.5 years for a coup event, how the former elected officials inside of the 44th administration participated in running a shadow government headed up by the former president, who had an apartment, I think it was like 5 blocks or 10 blocks or something like that from the White House in Washington, D.C., which is very unusual.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, I think it was reported by the media, believe it or not, that it was so unusual there had not been a case that they could find where a U.S. president had ever done that before. When we look at the potential dirt, if you will, or potential evidence that can come from talking heads like Maduro, who were obviously on the ground in Venezuela when these hacks were occurring against the U.S. election system. This is a man who was very involved in the activities of the Cartel de los Soles. Because of that, he would have been very involved in who and what and where from the intelligence community was on the ground in Venezuela, how they did business, how they had been doing business in that area for over 20 years. This is someone who's aware of how Smartmatic works, who's aware that his own elections were stolen on his behalf. But I would submit to you that when offered the Riot Act and given a way out to preserve his life and limb, you might have someone willing to talk and work with U.S. investigators about a potential act of war that occurred against the United States of America. So all of this tying back to Russiagate, it emanates from the head of the activities that Obama and really Comey and Brennan and Clapper and others put into motion between 2015 and the very end of 2016 into early 2017. And I find it very fascinating that Obama is now lawyering up. We've heard these rumors. They've not been fully confirmed yet, but I've seen a couple of very interesting articles that suggest that there's much more going on there. The characteristic silence from this individual on the social media space after the Iran war started gives me even more pause, because we know that Iran received a lot of illicit cash from this individual, and you may have Iranian members of the former government who are willing to surrender to the U.S. military in exchange for what they know, in exchange for conveyance of the intelligence. Here's how we did it. Here's who directed the hacks at the IRGC, which were sanctioned under EO 13848. Here's how we managed to infiltrate election systems. Here's how we managed to work with the Mexican cartels to infiltrate certain components of the American Southwest. Here's our back channels and how we operated with Venezuela or North Korea. So it all ends up connected, and it all, from the U.S. side of things, ties back to the insular group surrounding the 44th president. And I'm going to cap this segment off by saying this, John Michael, and this is just sort of like an obvious ode for the audience out there. Do we really think that the president of the United States would post not once, not twice, but 3 separate times in 2025 alone that Obama would face a military commission for his crimes against the American people? I think that we either have to assume the president of the United States is 100% off of his rocker, or he is absolutely conveying to us what is going to become a true and objective and concrete reality going forward. And there's really only 2 ways to slice that. The man is either nuts, or he's very determined and very aware of how this was done and what was done to the American people. But at the same time, we cannot have President Trump heading up the investigative efforts. He cannot be judge, jury, and executioner. He has to be the mouthpiece, but other people have to do their part and do their roles, not only for the constitutionality of the entire event, but to showcase to the world that we did this right. We did this by the book. We discovered what happened. It's the largest treason event in American history that we know of, and there has to be a punishment commensurate with what was done to the American people. And we're seeing that rolled out in phases beginning all of the way back in early 2025, continuing again with recent remarks by DNI Gabbard at a press conference at the White House. I want to say it was just within the last few weeks. And all of that building up to what I believe is going to be the overturning of the election result of 2020 and the potential offering to President Trump, either by the Supreme Court or by another authoritative force of equivalent effect, to potentially run for a third term, because the man should have had a 2020 to 2025 term as well.
Wow, you unpack so much good stuff there that I completely agree with, and I'm going to go with the latter. He's not nuts, and also, as you stated, he can't be the judge, jury, and executioner. But the evidence has been gathered by the officials in the DNI. As you said, everything's being done standardly, methodically, but also optically for the world and our country to accept such an act as fact, and so that we can get it processed through. And we all know the punishment for treason, and what lies ahead. And we don't like dates, of course, but in my mind, it would make sense for that subject to be processed through the tribunal prior to July. Now, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. I certainly don't know the plan to that extent. It's going to happen, in my opinion. When it happens, that's a toss of a coin. I'd like to see it happen before July. I think it makes sense, at least from the limited information I have. But it'll happen when it happens, and it's going to happen. I want to move us into very briefly on this, because it's something that the podcasters, by and large, not all of them, but many of them over the years, have really done a disservice and created a lot of mud and confusions for the people in our country, and that is the EBS. Next Tuesday at 3 o'clock. Oh, wait, it's going to be next Friday at 2 p.m. And it's been going on like that for what, 7, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, and it hasn't happened. And so let's just cap this EBS EAS conversation out. I will say this: I've spoken with my military panels. I have 2 different military panels that I meet with monthly: Global Defense War, and the other one, Eyes on Gitmo. Different folks in each panel, and pretty much everyone's on the record stating it's more than likely going to happen. So my question to you is 2-part. Do you believe it'll happen? And in what way, I'm curious what your view is, how will it be used if and when it happens?
Well, let me answer the question in a couple of parts here. The first part, will it happen or not? I have always been on the train, and I will maintain my status on that train until all of this is over, that we must have an emergency alert action of some kind before this process is over, because that must run parallel with whatever last minute joker cards or ace ditch cards that the deep state opponent that we face is going to play in response to irreversible events such as the re-adjudication of the 2020 election. Now, at the same time, I'm like you, I'm loath to make hard and fast predictions. I've tried not to make hard and fast predictions on this event, because an EAS event, the last time that we had a true situation nationally, nationwide, where that was employed, was during the terrorist attack of 9/11/2001. And so because of the severity of that, I'm inclined to say that we would have to get pretty darn close to that severity again in some form or fashion before we would be able to justify to the American people what's happening and why it's happening, and especially if there is a protective deployment of, say, the National Guard in a simultaneous fashion, or components of the U.S. Army Reserve, who exist primarily and solely, firstly, if you will, to protect and preserve the nation and its borders and the Constitution that exists within it. And so with that, I just want to highlight all of the different variables that go into this calculus. We've had an invasion. President Trump has termed it an invasion for a number of years
That's
now.
right.
We've had an exhaustive exposure for many years, going back to 2022, 2023. Almost daily, there's a new illegal immigrant attack. There's a new illegal alien crime. There's some sort of threat of terrorism that's in the news now, every other week, it seems like we've got a planned terrorist attack. We had situations that emerged as recently as last year, which I would characterize as true bona fide acts of domestic terrorism, large scale destruction of property. Under the Biden administration, we saw foreign transnational crime syndicates occupying entire community sections inside of Denver, inside of Baltimore, inside of Philadelphia, in New York State, in Washington. We've seen another attempt just in the last 14 months from Antifa to occupy a semi-militarized zone inside of Seattle. We know what has occurred in Minneapolis, obviously, with the ICE drama that happened up there just a few months hence. And so I say all of this to say, and this is just a cross-section slice of a lot more that we could unpack as far as examples are concerned. But I say all of this to say that the population of the United States of America is being prepared for some sort of dramatic event. And that dramatic event would have to be commensurate in flavor and in essence with the types of things that we are being prepared with, the types of unusual violence that ties back almost exclusively to these organized criminal syndicates like Antifa that we know are not organic, or these organized transnational crime groups who had an invasion force that was facilitated by members of the United States government. We know that members of the cartel, I think it was the Jalisco cartel, have come out and said that they own Governor Katie Hobbs from Arizona. I'm not sure if she's still the governor. You'll have to pardon my ignorance on that. But this was a statement that was put out shortly after she came to office. We know that there's a lot of malign financial interests that tie back to foreign money, especially Chinese money, that run the gamut from California all the way to the Southeast and North Carolina and the East Coast. So this is a nationwide issue. And so the nation has been violated in some fashion. There has been a permeation in the fabric of the security of America. So how do we resolve that? Well, we can resolve that in a number of different ways. We can do years-long rotating law enforcement actions that transcend presidential administrations, which seems cumbersome and ill-advised given the fragility of some of the things happening in the world. Or we can provide a bit of a advance to go and collect $200 style attitude by admitting, not allowing, it's not the right word, but by enduring is the word I'm looking for, some sort of major civilization scale event, not unlike 9/11 2001. And so that's why I remain in the EBS camp. We know that the Q entity online stated that at some point along in this journey, there would be an EBS deployed to get a message to the American people about what was actually happening, and especially and expressly to circumvent the lying mainstream media and bypass that brainwashing apparatus. We've seen lots of EBS tests, flash tests, multi-minute tests that have come across every device you can conceive of. I've seen videos of EBS tests showing up on iPad tablets. I myself have had a test sent to my phone, my own personal phone, in the last 2 years. I was watching a Fox News broadcast about 6 months ago where right at the 17-minute mark during one of President Trump's speeches, there was a flash in the pan EBS test, probably a second and a half, maybe 2 seconds in length, and then it panned right back to the frame. So we're clearly seeing the digital apparatus stress tested for its ability to convey this all in a simultaneous way. Now, with that, I want to sort of back up here to the 80,000 foot point of view and say I have no idea what type of attack, what type of scenario, what type of potential disaster would occur to cause something like that again. We just know the scale of what it was the last time. So rather than try to prognosticate about the specifics, I think we're just better advised to acknowledge that as we go through this escalating period of pressure, there's going to have to come a point where the 15th round hits and the last cards that are in the deck come out. When we look at the patriotic cards that are in the deck, it's the adjudication or re-adjudication of the 2020 election. It's the beginning of serious government-level investigations into COVID and what happened with the pandemic nightmare and a massive crime against humanity. It is the complete dissolution of certain components of the intelligence community that are just uncleanable and cannot be handled, cannot be trusted to maintain themselves in a clean fashion going forward. And the other side of that coin, those last cards from the other side of the table, would be dramatic civilization altering events, any sort of rogue bomb that they're able to get through somewhere. Club K missile systems could be used for something like that, and they can fit inside storage containers. We've seen a tremendous amount of destabilization in the national fuel landscape, specifically with locomotives and anything traveling by railway. We've seen a lot of interruption and quite frankly, what I believe to be unusual events inside of the airframe, the aerial and air travel space. Just recently, we saw a collision that happened between an aircraft and I believe it was a fire truck at LaGuardia Airport. It's worth remembering that anything that is digital that relies on an avionics system or a geonavigational system can be hacked and can be leveraged against even the occupants of that particular system. If we look at what happened to the Ever Given tanker ship in 2021, it was clearly taken over by remote control and drew incredible patterns in the Red Sea right before it entered into the Suez Canal. The ship was literally running in circles and then left and right and doubling back over its own path. This was not something that the captain of the ship was purposefully doing. The ship was quite literally out of his control. We know that the CIA has the capability to do those types of things with vehicular systems, especially those that have onboard navigational systems, airframes, commercial airframes, certainly military airframes, but definitely commercial airframes would be vulnerable to the same type of interference. So I say all of this to say that we're already seeing some of those other side of the table cards being played out, being leveled up, if you will. And eventually it has to arrive at a point where the public can no longer stay in the dark about what's happening here. And that, I think, ends up being the linchpin for whatever emergency situation comes to the United States. And it makes sense to me that that situation would certainly have to occur. If it's going to occur, it would have to occur under a Trump presidency, whether it is this current Trump presidency, whether we see a third term of President Trump, and that's when it comes. I couldn't begin to say, but what I can say is we cannot risk moving the goalposts beyond the current situation of status quo that we've created, because it is the first time in literally 150 years that the status quo has been in favor of patriotic Americans and not against them by the same apparatus that we're seeking to take out.
Yes, great analysis, and you're in good company with a lot of the military folks I talk to, retired generals, brigadier generals, Delta Forces, Special Forces from multiple countries, retired lieutenant colonels, 107. So in my mind, the EAS, EBS is a foregone conclusion. How it's to be used and when is going to be something we'll all find out. But you laid the groundwork, in my opinion, very well as to why this is important. And the timing of it, of course, is going to be everything. In wrapping up in just a bit, SG, and thanks for your time, I want to comment on some, I wouldn't say lesser important, but I'll say it, lesser important issues, but that is on the mind of some folks, and I think it's worthy of some comments from you. A couple of things here. One, let's talk about briefly Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, and Candace Owens. I've broken it down to three possibilities, and I'm not even sure there could be more than three. I mean, technically there could be, but there's three possibilities of what's going on with these three individuals. And I think we can see a commonality between Tucker, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Candace Owens. It might be a fair statement to say that the lion's share of their place in media before us over these years has been favorable for President Trump, by and large, have been certainly not Democrat liberal, but more Christian conservative, or Republican, whatever, that side of the fence. I think it's a fair statement. And now all of a sudden, all three of them, in various different ways, completely different standpoints and viewpoints and statements they're making that are really confusing some folks within our movement. I boil it down to three things. They're enemies, and they'll be dealt with. They're completely clueless, thus they're reporting. Or three, they're part of the PSYOP. They're part of the show. They're part of the script. They're part of the plan. While I don't expect you to have a definitive answer, I think our audience would be very much on the edge of their seat to at least get your opinion about what the hell is going on with these three individuals.
Well, I, interestingly enough, I would probably answer the question in the same fashion that you just boiled it down. There really are only those three overarching possibilities there. With respect to all three individuals, I've had, professional respect for all of them. I've tried to, hold my tongue on certain rhetoric, because at the same time that things are going on with them, things are coming out on the other side of the four as well, which are equally insane, perhaps even more so. But I will say that with respect to all three of them, I think we have to acknowledge that there's a couple of different aspects at play. Number one, especially with Tucker and Candace, you can clearly see the influence of some sort of, I wouldn't call it secret society, but I would just say there's an ulterior motive that's going on, and the rhetoric is just so consistent and so very extreme that the ulterior motive has to be either good or bad. It can't really be in between. I don't think that it's just outright ignorance. I think there has to be something that's driving it. It's very interesting if you look into Mr. Carlson's early childhood schooling. He went to a very prestigious school that was known for, the servicing the very ultra wealthy elite kind of circles that went on when he was younger. Intelligence community assets have gone through that same school system. That's not to say that Mr. Carlson is or is not one. It's just to say that he was in that orbit, and that's something that is on his resume and in his history. With Miss Owens, she has some very interesting ties through her husband to at least one society that I believe to be adjacent to Freemasonry. Now, I'm not 100% sure about its actual bona fide connections, but I will say that it looks to be very much adjacent and very cloistered in that same sort of fashion. And so when I look at that, I always take what she says with a grain of salt. That does not mean that she's outright lying. I don't think that in many cases these individuals are outright lying, but I do think that we have to look at the saturation of the narrative that is put out by all three. With Miss Taylor Greene, I find it very interesting that almost immediately after her resignation from Congress, a marriage to a major White House press corps reporter was announced. So that's sort of a back channel access to what's going on in the press landscape. The ability to at least influence that reporting is obviously present there, because as you and I both know, and as your audience out there would admit, it's, if anyone's going to influence you, it's the person who you're going to bed with, and that's just how that works. And so when we look at the entire landscape that has emerged, your question, they're either good, they're bad, or they're indifferent and clueless. I think I would rule out indifferent and clueless entirely, and I would say they're either good or they're either bad. Now, here's where it gets very interesting. Even if they are bad, they're still playing a role that I would characterize as leveraging a component of the psyche of the population that's causing a massive wake up. Mr. Carlson's reporting, for example, about some of the activities undertaken by the state of Israel with respect to allies of the United States, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, etc. From what I can tell, most of that reporting is accurate. Certainly the historic numbers that he draws from when he makes these comparisons about our relationship to Tel Aviv and Tel Aviv's gainfulness from us versus what they can offer back to us, these are bona fide statistics that are not being forged. They're not fungible. They're just being reported for what they are. At the same time, Miss Owens also has some interesting points to be made about the influence of secret societies, but I've seen less concrete connections coming from Miss Owens with respect to some of her rhetoric, and I don't think all of that is by complete and total accident. I think that some of it probably could be chalked up as simple carelessness, but at the same time, I did see a very interesting picture just a few days ago where she attended a Catholic speaking ceremony, and she appears to be the newest member of the Boot Club. So looking at what's happening out there in the world, these are major journalistic style podcasts, and Miss Taylor Greene having sort of the same broad appeal, but from a different angle, not a journalistic angle, but from a former member of Congress angle. I would characterize this as, regardless of what the motive is, good, bad, indifferent, or otherwise, it is producing a net positive result for the entirety of the population. Now, is there some division that comes from it? Absolutely, because the narratives coming from all three are very polarizing. Is there some questions, or are there some questions, I should say, to be drawn from a lot of this, especially with Miss Taylor Greene's handling of the supposed Epstein file situation and the exposure of victims, both in facial recognition form on camera, but also calling for names of perpetrators to be released prior to due process actually being meted out. I think that that is something that should be eyed with some skepticism, but that could be just a very impassioned rhetoric coming from someone who really didn't understand or perhaps does not understand how due process has to work in order to be bulletproof. You know, you cannot expose the name of a perpetrator of a heinous crime to the 24/7 national news media and expect that individual to then have a conviction which will hold up in appellate court, because it's very easy to say, well, the jury was tainted because my name was all over the entire world media, and so no jury on earth could have maintained itself as being objective and without bias against me, and that would almost certainly result in a conviction being overturned on appeal because the constitutional due process was not followed. So looking at what has come from all three of these individuals, I think all of them deserve to have a bit of skepticism thrown their way. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be polarizing and full of vitriol ourselves or assuming that we know everything that's going on. You know, Tucker Carlson remains the only Western journalist to have true access to the president of Russia over the last 4 to 5 years. That would not have happened if the Russian intelligence services considered him to be any potential threat whatsoever. And we know that Russia is very closely aligned with some high levels of U.S. military command for the same end goal here, which is the rebalancing and liberation of the planet at large. So that's a feather, I think, that stands in his cap. But regardless, as we look at all of them, I would say that the net positive here is that people are diving into the rhetoric and the issues that are being brought up, and they're finding some pretty common themes, even though some of the details may be carelessly off script.
That's a great takeaway. The net positive by creating the narrative and gaining different perspectives and having the conversation about this. I think that's valuable and well noted. The other thing you mentioned is Tucker with with his access to Putin. That's interesting. Look, we're going to have to see. And I agree with you. I threw the clueless part in there because, well, it's a possibility, but highly unlikely. These are intelligent individuals, and with various degrees of connectivity, and have done some great work over the years. So yeah, they're enemies or they're not. You can't be both. And we'll see how it plays out. You know, part of the psyop. I don't know. But thank you for commenting on that. And in closing, well, before, just real quick, um, the airports. You touched on it before. I mean, we had the no power for several hours, as I recall, in the Denver airport, and there's all kinds of talk about what goes on underneath that airport and the murals that were there and all this. But recently, we had power outage in an airport. I didn't dig into it to find out what happened, or at least what they told us happened. And the same thing here with this plane in LaGuardia. You know, I don't know the details. I'm not following it, but I'm seeing a lot of airport activity. Am I over questioning this? Are these just coincidences that things that don't usually happen are all happening at once at airports?
Well, I think it's interesting, John Michael. I think, you know, based on conversations we've had before, you're probably well aware that I don't believe in coincidences. I think that there are always cooperative incidents that are occurring. And I think that that's exactly what we're seeing with the airport landscape writ large. It's very interesting, though, and I want to bring in another angle on this. You know, people talk about the lack of funding with DHS and the drama with TSA. We can cast that against these unusual shutdowns, outages, obstructions, things like that that are happening at these airports, which are either delaying operations or completely preventing operations for that day or for a good portion of a day, you know, for whatever purpose. But airports happen to be one of the largest exchange nodes, if you will, one of the largest vanishing points for trafficked human beings and trafficked illicit substances as well. Drugs, biological agents, weaponry that can be fit inside, you know, luggage containers and large suitcases or things of that nature. And so With DHS, DHS in particular is a very fascinating arm of the U.S. government. DHS is the primary lead department within the executive branch of the government that allows for um, the enforcement of anti-trafficking activities, trafficking of drugs, trafficking of weaponry, trafficking of human beings, organized RICO-style criminal activity. Right, the Department of Homeland Security is the lead agency, if you will, to tackle a great deal of that. And so, witnessing the funding situation that has occurred, the supposed shutdown inside DHS, which is affecting a lot of it, but is not affecting certain mission critical functions. We have this malaise that has now taken root at various airports where things are slowed down. They're almost to a crawl. It's sort of like trying to walk through, quicksand, if you will, right, without sinking. It's like trying to wade through a mud hole. And so there's benefits that come to that. Obviously, there's no benefits that come to the ordinary American or the ordinary man or woman who's just trying to get from point A to point B. And that is the reality we have to acknowledge. There is some human cost that is paid here because people do miss flights. Things are getting canceled. There is a dramatic amount of inconvenience that comes from it. But net positives that can come from things like this are that individuals who are walking through an airport with a child in their suitcase are now stuck in that airport, and they cannot get that human being or that trafficked item or that trafficked person or whatever out of that airport and off into the system, vanishing, again, into that night, if you will. And so with the deployment coming up, as a matter of fact, I think it comes up tomorrow, if it didn't start today, with ICE agents assisting TSA at various agents. ICE happens to be another main agency inside the U.S. government who is equipped to handle trafficking investigations from front to back. In other words, they don't just start the paperwork and then hand it off somewhere. They run those investigations from start point to end point, and they can actually detain individuals for extended periods of time if there's a bona fide probable cause connection between those individuals and organized criminal activity that affects the United States from an illegal standpoint, from an illegal alien standpoint. And we know that a huge number of traffickers, a huge number of coyotes that are inside the United States of America are not U.S. citizens. They are foreign-born nationals who have made their way here through some auspice or another, but have never attained citizenship. So this is sort of another backhanded fashion, in my opinion, with what's going on at these airports. I think we're seeing more than just the political war that we're being told on, happening on Capitol Hill between these various factions that are attempting to shut down this or withhold that or pearl clutch this or whatever over the SAVE Act and over this act and over that act. It's all over, some sort of ridiculousness that they're happening. But I believe more than anything outside of that, excuse that we're being given is that this is a way from an unconventional warfare aspect to go in and really double down on the investigation, the tracking, the surveillance, and quite literally the apprehension of various components of trafficking at all different levels. When TSA agents are reading monitors, for example, we know that TSA has problematic elements that are involved, that are within the agency. We know that there's bribery that has happened. We know that corruption has taken hold. We know that over $7 million US made its way through TSA Minneapolis over a period of just 3 years. There's no way that agents were not aware that those suitcases were full of dollar bills, the millimeter rays that they utilize, the X-ray technology machines that they have, various high power imaging machines, all of that tying into the aspect of their job that would let them know and would alert them to that kind of transaction, or that kind of movement of material happening through their airport security. But we also know that, again, corruption can take hold, that bribery has likely been involved in these areas, and so a lot of that was just allowed to happen. Now, if you export that model to the 10 busiest airports in the United States of America, we have to ask who and what is being purposefully allowed through by individuals in TSA who are either just careless, who are disinterested in their position, or who are outright captured by a malign interest outside of their official duties and capacities. That problem is sidelined when you bring in another agency, and now that agency is also looking at those monitors. You can't hide the pornographic material on your laptop, for example, when there's another pair of eyes watching what you're watching on the screen. And so the same, I think, is true of what we're going to see in these airport circumstances. And it's very likely that that also plays into the difficulties at some of these major airports, LaGuardia being a massive exportation airport for getting things out of U.S. jurisdiction and very quickly into international airspace, which would put it beyond the reach of the U.S. military, except for, a bona fide wartime situation occurring. Denver being one of the largest trafficking hubs that we know of in the entirety of the continental U.S. because of its central location, because of its massive underground connections to the city sewer system that exists there, which itself is connected to cave systems beneath the city of Denver. These are bona fide realities that play into this broader discussion. But fundamentally, when I look at what's happening in the airports, I don't see a congressional war that is causing a lot of inconvenience for Americans, though that is true. I see an unconventional landscape shaping itself up to absolutely decimate hidden trafficking and hidden criminality that's going on inside of these major airport institutions that has been allowed to go on for one reason or another, or has been able to slip by for one reason or another for a very, very long time.
Yes, there's always a lot more than meets the eye when it comes to headline news, and you just unpacked quite a bit to think about, and for people to go down some rabbit holes on concerning the airports. I appreciate everything you've done weighing in on all these issues. Next time we and I speak, I want to make sure we have time to talk about the elections, the SAVE Act, the national emergency declaration that may end up being instituted. Will there be a midterm? We're going to discuss all of that at another time. But in closing, real brief, because this is for another day and another chapter in our journey of saving America, putting our constitutional republic back, and redirecting humanity on a course correction. I'd like to dive into this in great detail later on, but just a quick drive-by conversation. AI, of course, is doing some wonderful things right now, very useful, at least what they've given us access to, and is changing the world, but has a very concerning dark side component, perhaps, to it as well. Any brief comment about AI in a good sense, and any concerns that SG has about AI moving forward?
Well, I would be remiss to say that I am without any concern at all. I think that my primary concern with AI is that AI becomes the brainchild, if you will, becomes the infant that we as collective humanity train it to be. The good book says, train up a child in the way that they shall go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. And I think that that line is just as applicable to what we have going on at AI, except instead of a nuclear family with a husband and a wife and children involved, we have a nuclear human family with all collective cultures, all collective viewpoints sort of feeding into things. And there are malign interests that are involved, and we should acknowledge that. There's financial institutions that have been involved for a very long time with various technological advances that have not had the public interest at heart. But for the first time ever, we as humanity have the microphone. It's not just mainstream media. It's not just tech giants. It's not just Wall Street institutions. It is the ordinary person. It is the upset xenial on TikTok because they recognize the work-life balance is so out of whack. It is the farmer. It is the rancher. It is the butcher that takes to YouTube or takes to X to show people that the things that they're being told are certain things in stores with their food supply are not actually what they're being told. And so in that sense, I think that we've been given a ballast, if you will, that was not present, was not possible with the development and deployment of AI and its trajectory going all the way back to the early 2000s, really beginning in earnest with the Pentagon's Project LifeLog. And Project LifeLog ended on the same day that Facebook as a company announced its initial public run of funding and becoming a thing. And there's some interesting connections between Facebook and DARPA that we don't have time to get into. But fundamentally, it's been a long-term plan for AI to be sort of like Skynet, if you will, or like Vicky from the movie I, Robot with Will Smith. People will be aware of that movie, and they should go and look for the character Vicky, because that was the envisioning that the occultist controllers had for the world of the future for a long time. Now, and this is why this is why my concerns are not nearly as grievous as they would have been, say, 8, 10, 12 years ago. Now we, the people, have the ability to affect the development of that new organism. We have the ability to teach that child the way it should go. We have the ability to tell it, the actual truth, and to substantiate that truth with first-hand source documents. We have millions of files from Epstein, for example, and that's only one document dump. That's only one depot that we have to choose from. We have declassified CIA archives literally in the hundreds of thousands of pages for everything from dark activities in South America to undertakings in the Middle East, Africa, the Mediterranean, things that the CIA has been doing here at home. In addition to just documents, a lot of those archives include video components, which can be fed to AI engines and used as source material for them to, affect their worldview and shape their worldview. And we have, of course, the modern day flow of events, which requires no declassification, but we can see plainly in real time it's either good for humanity or it's bad for humanity. And any intelligent organism of any kind, whether it is true godly consciousness intelligence, which is what a human being is, or whether it is a step down version of that, this artificially intelligent sort of aggregation machine that AI is sort of emerging itself to become, either of the two can look at objective reality that has been reinforced and reiterated time and time and time again, and begin to form long-term pattern recognition cycles that become belief systems and begin to govern overall behavior. So as I look at what's happening with the AI situation, we shouldn't discount the effect it will have disruptively on things like economy, certainly on things like manufacturing. We've seen the disruption in the finance space with AI taking on a majority of, like, say, trading, for example, stock trading, bond trading, currency trading, things like that. But overall, I don't think that those nuanced purposes that AI can meet, those tasks that AI can do either with human beings or for human beings, is the crux of the matter. I think the crux of the matter is, does AI have the same lens on human growth, human vitality, planetary management, holistic health for both the human being and the earth itself as we collectively as humanity do? And for the first time in really all of human history, we have the ability to affect what that landscape is going to look like long term. It's not being dictated for us.
That's a great point, and we'll close out there. Well, thank you very much, SG, for weighing in, ping-ponging all over the map on various different issues that we're facing today. But you're the guy that can take that on very intelligently, very well articulated, and giving our viewers a lot to think about and hopefully settle them down a bit on certain issues. But thank you very much. What's the best place? I understand a bit ago you were disrupted a bit in your delivery of service. In other words, censored. Was that true? And has that been handled? And where's the best place for people to follow you?
It is true. It was a situation that had occurred on the X platform, actually. And to tell you the truth, John Michael, even as we sit and have this conversation, I have no additional clarity on why it happened or why I was reinstated with, all hearts free and clear, so to speak, a clean bill of health. So I can still be found on the same 4 platforms as a result of that. I can be found on rumble.com, which is where a lot of my long form podcast content is found. That is at the URL rumble.com/user/Q News Patriot. I'm not on Rumble by the name SG Anon. I can be found on Truth Social at the handle Real, REAL, SG Anon with a red check mark. I can be found on X at the handle TheQ News Patriot with a blue check mark. And I can be found on the Telegram platform at the address t.me/real, REAL, Q News Patriot. It's always a pleasure, John Michael, and I very much appreciate you having me here. It's a team effort, and